ever scroll through the news and you just think like, how? Like, how did they get there? How do we go from don't eat the cookies before dinner to, trying to figure out like all these really complex moral dilemmas we see out there in the world?
It is. It's pretty amazing to think about how we develop that sense of right and wrong, isn't it?
It really is. And one of the biggest names in that is Kohlberg, right?
Absolutely.
Kohlberg's theory of moral development, which is the stage theory all about how people progress through different stages of reasoning when it comes to moral issues. But he was really focused on the individual, right? Like their own thought process.
Yeah, and it's fascinating stuff, but it does sort of leave you with the question of like, well, what about the environment? What about the context that those individuals are developing in? And that's where this idea of Clarke's transactional theory comes in.
Oh, yeah. I like that. So it's not just like looking at the person, it's looking at everything around them too, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like you can't just look at the plant growing. You have to look at the soil, the sunlight, all that stuff.
Yeah, perfect. I love that. And so that's kind of what we're diving into today, is the way these two theories actually go together to help us understand how the environments we learn in can actually shape our sense of what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
Yeah, it is going to be fun. So first up, let's talk about this social presence idea from Clarke. Now, I think it sounds kind of straightforward, but how does that actually play into the stages that Kohlberg was talking about?
Well, it's almost like social presence is kind of like that real world application of some of those stages, right? Because if you think about it, Kohlberg talks about a stage where understanding social norms and expectations becomes really important for moral development.
Right.
Well, social presence is what gives us the context for actually understanding those things.
So it's like not just knowing the rules, but it's like seeing them play out.
Yeah, exactly. And seeing like the nuances, right? Imagine if you were taking like a college seminar on ethics. It's one thing to read the theories in a textbook.
Right.
But it's a whole other thing when you've got a group of people, students, and they're debating, they're respectfully disagreeing with each other, right? They're challenging each other's views. The professor's in there kind of guiding that discussion. That's high social presence. And that really pushes you to think about the why behind ethical behavior and ethical norms.
Totally. And especially when you think about like going from that kind of like good boy, good girl stage that Kohlberg talks about to understanding broader societal laws and stuff. You need that social back and forth.
Absolutely.
Do you think you can get that just from observing? Or does it need to be like an intense social presence?
That is a really interesting question. And I think you're right that observation definitely plays a role, right? We watch people, we learn from that.
Yeah.
But Clarke's theory would say that the more we actually actively participate in those social interactions, the stronger, the deeper our understanding of those moral principles becomes. And I always think about this with language. You can pick up some vocabulary just by listening to someone talk.
Yeah.
But you don't really become fluent until you're actually having a conversation.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. It's that back and forth.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so then what about cognitive presence?
Okay.
How does that piece that Clarke talks about connect to what Kohlberg was saying about moral reasoning?
Okay, this is where things get really cool, I think, because Kohlberg tells us that real moral development isn't just about feeling bad when we do something wrong, right? Like, oh, I feel guilty.
Right.
It's about the reasoning behind that, right? It's about actually being able to analyze, why something is wrong. And cognitive presence is all about creating an environment that fosters that kind of analytical thinking.
So like a classroom where you're just memorizing rules, that's probably low cognitive presence and maybe not doing a whole lot for your moral development, right?
Probably not. I got it. But imagine instead that you're in a philosophy class and the professor throws out this really complex ethical dilemma, something that's ripped from the headlines, right? Something really relevant.
Yeah.
And then encourages everyone in the class to not only form their own opinions, but to defend those opinions using logic, evidence, maybe even challenging some long-held assumptions, right? That's high cognitive presence. And that's like a gym, for your moral reasoning skills.
I love that, like a gym. That's a really good analogy. But it makes me think too about the different ways people learn, right? Some people are very analytical, some are more feeling-based. Does Clarke's theory account for that at all? Or is it assuming that everyone's going to thrive in that really kind of intense cognitive environment?
That's a great point. And I think that is something that Clarke does acknowledge, right? That cognitive presence isn't about trying to force everybody into this same analytical box, right?
Yeah.
It's about providing a space where people can engage with the material in a way that's meaningful for them, that really gets them thinking. So for some people, that might mean heated debate, right? They thrive on that.
Yeah.
For others, it might be more like quiet reflection and writing. So different strokes for different folks. The key is that the environment encourages that act of wrestling with those ideas.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's go to transactional distance, which I'll be honest, when I first saw that, I was like, what?
Yeah.
It sounds very technical. But is it basically about how much intellectual freedom you have in a learning environment?
You nailed it, yeah. High transactional distance is like that old school classroom. You know, the one where the teacher's at the front, they're dictating, you're memorizing, there's no room for questioning, right? That's high distance.
Right.
Low distance is more like you have a mentor, and that mentor is challenging you. They're pushing you to think for yourself, to explore different viewpoints, maybe even to disagree with them.
Right. Which, looking back to Kohlberg, you need that to develop your own moral compass.
Absolutely right. You're not going to be able to develop it if you're not allowed to, even explore the terrain.
Right. But do you think there's ever a time where that high transactional distance could be beneficial? I'm thinking about like those earlier Kohlberg stages where having very clear rules and expectations, like that's kind of crucial.
That's a really great point. And I think you're right. There can be times when a more structured, like a higher distance approach is actually appropriate, especially when we're thinking about earlier stages of moral development. Think about teaching a small child about like basic safety rules. You need to have those clear boundaries.
Yeah.
You need those expectations to establish that foundation, right?
Right.
But as people mature, as they move through those stages, that distance needs to shrink, right?
Yeah.
It needs to shrink to allow for that exploration, that critical thinking that really fuels that higher level moral reasoning.
Yeah. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. This has been so insightful, and it really highlights something I think that both these theories talk about, which is the importance of discussion.
Absolutely.
Right? Like iron sharpens iron.
Yes.
When you're bouncing ideas off other people, it makes you really look at what you believe, right?
Yeah. And not just look at it, but articulate it, right?
Yeah.
You have to put it into words. You have to defend it. You might even change your mind based on what other people are saying. That's where real growth happens. It's not when we're just in isolation. It's when we're actually having that dialogue, that back and forth. People, if it gets a little messy, it's in that space that we really start to understand ourselves and understand our own morality.
So for everyone listening, I think the big takeaway here is that it's not just about us, in our heads thinking about this stuff. The environment, the people we're around, the ways that we're encouraged to think, all of that actually impacts how our sense of morality grows.
Yeah, it's that interplay. It's our minds and it's the world around us. They both shape each other.
Yeah, I love that. So I think a good thing for everyone listening to think about is, where have you seen these theories kind of play out in your own life, right? Think about those mentors you've had. Think about different classrooms, maybe even online communities. How did those groups of people actually change the way you think about right and wrong?
It's a good question to ponder.
It is.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.